Next up is Kavin Senapathy. She is an award-winning science journalist and author. Senapathy's writing appears in a plethora of different publications and covers everything from genomics to biological essentialism and racism in society and in medicine, to why parents should probably not take their infant to a chiropractor. Who knew? Probably why you don't have kids. There's something for everybody. If you are that person that was looking for parenting books for raising secular children, she's got a book. You can buy it. She'll sign it later. Senapathy is an elder millennial, a parent, a lifelong atheist, and based solely on a 3-minute observation from last night's dance party, an avid Avril Lavigne fan. Today she's going to be talking about their new book, The Progressive Parent, and they'll shed light on leveraging science and social justice to help kids thrive. So please welcome Kavin Senapathy.
So getting right into it, in many ways, the forces of injustice and oppression are more in our faces than they've ever been. Our rights are in immediate danger, and children are dealing with the fallout. So I didn't know what would transpire back when I researched and wrote this book. I was not aware that the concepts it covers would be more crucial than ever for people to grasp, but here we are. So this might sound counterintuitive from an author with a book in the parenting section, but I'm not here to give mostly prescriptive answers. The book doesn't contain much of it. It does include some prescriptive answers that run counter to the dominant narrative, especially when the most popular advice isn't as science-based as it's made out to be. But one thing I know about parenting and parenthood is that the answers are almost never as straightforward as we hope. And this book is not by a parenting expert. Really, when you think about it, and I've thought about it, nobody in and of themselves is a parenting expert, whether they're a doctor, an economist, or a psychologist. Personally, I'm a science writer, a lifelong learner, and a parent of adolescents who are doing well by several measures. And if you'll allow me to brag for just a moment, my 8th graders' friends genuinely say I'm one of the cooler parents. Yep. And at least one of them comes to me for advice on purpose. Like she'll talk the day ahead or the previous day with my kid and say, I need to talk to your mom about advice about whatever. So that is, I would say, one of the biggest feathers in my cap, at least presently. So this book serves 2 overarching purposes. First, it walks people through how to think about and navigate various parenting challenges and questions, from a justice and science-centered lens. And second, it highlights the stories and work of some of the many activists, researchers, educators, doctors, and other folks fighting for justice for all children. So ultimately, it's about thinking through how we can position ourselves as parents and as other adults who care about justice and the truth based on our values and with the resources, information, and bandwidth at hand, and given all the information, facts, and science. So, for instance, I've covered the science of infant feeding for years. You can find some of these articles and videos that I've worked on online on my website, but I had the opportunity to go into detail in this book. And the book doesn't endorse the dominant advice that exclusive breastfeeding is the optimal way to feed a baby. So the book uses infant feeding as a case study in why it's important to delve into the science, history, and social context around how and why we are taught to believe that exclusive breastfeeding is optimal. And that's not even getting into the problem with an optimization mindset about children. So the book concludes that either human milk formula or a combination of both can be a healthy diet for the vast majority of infants, and that this choice is not going to make or break a kid's health or lifelong success, despite everything we've been told. So in addition to a science writer's approach, we know that who someone is, that is, their social identity, shapes the work that they do. So for instance, we know this to be true of scientists. Their lived experiences and identities can and do influence their research questions and approaches. So, of course, an author's identity is going to shape the books they write. Personally, I approach all of the issues it covers as a neurodivergent, non-binary, openly non-religious parent of two, a child of immigrants myself, and as someone who cares about the truth, which, as we've seen, has been a theme at FREEFLO today. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so I'm a product of that era, which is fairly obvious in the book. It includes references to things like the Jetsons and flying cars and the Nintendo Entertainment System. I was one of the cool apartments in the 80s where everyone came over to play Super Mario Brothers. So I'll state this and echo what so many others have been talking about this weekend. No matter what anyone says, diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, sometimes known as DEAI or DEI, are not only important, they're a reflection of the literal truth. Humanity is prismatic, and DEI is simply how we make sure that the scientific truth about humanity is reflected in our systems and our institutions. So those who oppose DEI are opposing the truth to the benefit of those in power, namely cis, het, able-bodied white men, and to the detriment of everyone else. So it's in that spirit that the book draws from many diverse sources. But even with diversity at the center of my work, I can only produce my writing from my point of view, while striving to keep my perspective as inclusive as possible. And as I've discussed with so many other writers and science writers, that is always a work in progress. And having the bandwidth and resources to read stacks of peer-reviewed papers to seek science-based answers is an immense privilege, so that's how I treat it. And then I should also add that for me, learning science-based answers to pertinent questions has become almost a coping mechanism for my anxiety and other neuroses. So that's all to say that I am very fun at dinner parties. So I'm going to talk about the book's use of the word progressive to describe parents. I know that people tend to have opinions about this word, so people ask pretty regularly about the title of the book and the intention behind it. So fun fact, journalists don't usually write their own headlines, and authors, in many cases, don't write their own titles, especially when working with a traditional publisher. So when my editor proposed The Progressive Parent, I had complicated feelings, knowing that in many of my circles, people don't necessarily identify with the word progressive, and knowing that there's significant variation in the views of progressive. But ultimately, I took the assignment as a challenge, in that parents with ostensibly progressive values, including science and social justice, are quite diverse, and not at all a monolith, but there are strong threads that tie them together. And so it was that common ground that my editor was asking me to follow. So the word progressive most broadly connects parents who share these basic values. Many of you are likely familiar with a variation of the yard sign in these photos. The sign went viral in 2016 when Trump was first elected, and it has had staying power since then. I see these signs in neighborhoods all over the US over the years and to this day. So there are a few variations of the sign. The original version reads, "In this house we believe Black lives matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, love is love, and kindness is everything." So there are reasons that the sign resonates. I've heard some people say that families who display it are participating in a form of virtue signaling. Yet others say it gives them immense comfort to see these signs, especially in a conservative or unfamiliar town. So there's power in the sign's message if we can also act intentionally on these shared core values. To me, the science is real piece seemed to stand out from the others. Like, what does science is real mean? It wasn't totally clear to me when I first encountered it. So the book teases out what science is real means to parents and families and communities. And then it goes a step further to look at all of these other pieces of the yard sign and ask and answer the question, what does science have to do with justice? So it delves into what it might look like to take that fundamental sentiment that science is real, together with all those other values, and take them beyond a yard sign or a bumper sticker. So how can the people responsible for children's well-being exercise these values? So here's the table of contents. It includes defining the progressive parent's dilemma, healthy scrutiny of science, gender and sex, race, ethnicity, and racism, living a so-called clean life, parenting with feminism, including case studies in bodily autonomy, ableism and fat phobia, greenwashing and sustainability, and vaccines. So these chapter titles may seem unrelated, but they are so much more connected that they first appear. So there are two main themes of the book that tie all of it together. First, despite what we've been told, there is no such thing as a normal or optimal kid or even human being. Science shows that we are so much more prismatic and dynamic than we've been led to believe. And the second is that the onus to ensure children's well-being is often disproportionately placed on individual sets of parents and not systems. So it's drilled into parents that we need to take control of our kids' health and well-being. But the problem is that with practically every aspect of kids' well-being, there is a, again, tendency to place an outsized onus on individual sets of parents while absolving those in power. So in this rather misleading narrative, parents can avoid unwanted outcomes if only we put forth sufficient effort. Now, in science communication, we hear a lot about the problem of assuming a causal relationship when all that the data can show is a correlation between an action and an outcome, like, say, eating fast food in childhood and heart disease in adulthood. But the problem isn't merely that it's unwarranted to assume causation, unless researchers can elucidate a causal mechanism behind something. It's even darker than that. Often, assuming that a parenting behavior causes an outcome simply because there's a correlation upholds an inequitable status quo. And that assumption harms children. So it's easier to urge parents to take control of their child's health than to solve complex systemic problems that have some significant impacts on kids. So of course, this isn't to say that parents have no individual responsibility to their children. They do, but the question is, which individual parenting actions make a difference? And which ones might we be doing in vain? And how is the focus on our own kids and our own nuclear families holding back justice? Could people use that bandwidth to hold systems and those in power accountable for all kids to thrive? So chapter 2 is titled Healthy Scrutiny of Science, and you might wonder, why emphasize scrutiny of science rather than belief in science? So as someone who loves science, I've learned that the concept of trust in science has many layers that are worth interrogating. So I've been at the March for Science with a megaphone. If trusting or believing in science means believing in certain findings, like that the Earth is spherical and not flat, or that climate change is real and urgent, then I am right there with the believers. But polls show that most people do believe that science is real. If real means that scientific findings based on systematic observations are an actual thing that helps us discern the truth. But it's often hard to tell which messaging reflects the most comprehensive evidence-based truth and which reflects an agenda that doesn't have all children's best interests at heart. So this book helps readers take a step back and learn how to scrutinize the workings of science in addition to harnessing it. The book covers a few crucial concepts around science, including the nuances around the concept of consensus, digging deeper into correlation versus causation, risk perception, and the problem with applying population risk to individuals, how to spot assumptions that scientists sometimes wrongly take to be true, how to spot the interest behind scientific messaging and research, and the difference between the concept of science literacy and science curiosity, and more. So I am all about democratizing science. Contrary to the elitist notion that regular people without doctorates are incapable of doing their own research about a health-related question, I strongly believe that most people have the intellectual capacity to do so if they have the tools, time, support, and sheer curiosity. And those are not easy to come by. One of the most important concepts in the book is the problem with dehumanization. The most pervasive forms of dehumanization are subtle and built into everything around us, even appearing benign, and it harms children. So I think many in this audience would be familiar with forms of pseudoscience like homeopathy, which, as we all know, is not real medicine. And we all know about the harms of using religious justification to withhold people's human rights and respect. But as a lifelong atheist and a health writer, I am convinced that the most insidious evil is biological essentialism, which is at the root of dehumanization. So this is basically the pseudoscientific and secular belief that traits like personality, intelligence, skills, demeanor, body type, sexuality, health problems, gender, and a slew of other characteristics are biologically innate, mostly encoded in the DNA and the very essence of our bodies, and not a result of external influences. So I am a genetics nerd, so I'm not saying that human traits have nothing to do with genetics, but it is much more nuanced than we've been led to believe. So as the book discusses, a big part of undoing biological essentialism and dehumanization involves what researcher Brian Donovan and colleagues at the Humane Genetics Research Lab at BSCS Science Learning in Colorado Springs call moving beyond Mendel toward a humane genomics education. So a big issue is that what we learned about biology is so oversimplified to the point of being practically wrong. So this book talks about how to start honoring the complexity of biology. Many of us will remember learning about the work of Gregor Mendel, whose experiments in the 1860s used plant breeding to elucidate basic principles of inheritance of traits or observable characteristics in the common pea plant. People who took high school biology may recall the Punnett squares used to predict the types of offspring in a crossbreeding experiment. So in his plants, certain observable characteristics like yellow or green color or smooth or wrinkly skin are inherited in predictable ways based on whether a trait is dominant or recessive. Mendel figured out that some unknown substance, which we now know to be DNA, passes traits from parents to offspring. So in humans, a few traits are known to be passed down in this roughly Mendelian fashion. Some well-known ones are a widow's peak or attached earlobes, but the vast majority of human traits are far more complex and involve variations in multiple genes that interact with a web of environmental factors and manifest as countless traits like a powerful singing voice or a way with words or addiction, social anxiety or migraines, etc. So there's no Punnett square that predicts if you're going to get social anxiety. So how can we honor who our children are if we don't understand the biological rainbow of what humanity encompasses? So that's another big part of what this book illustrates. So this has been on a lot of our minds lately. The book has a chapter on gender and sex. Now, those pushing for anti-trans legislation would have us believe that it's scientific to say that biological female humans are defined by their XX sex chromosomes and corresponding typical reproductive features, while biological males are XY. This is the root fallacy behind anti-trans rhetoric and legislation. And I gotta say, to be clear, there's at least one member organization of the Secular Coalition for America that also proudly promotes this myth. So it's not just Christian fundamentalists touting this nonsense. Some of it is coming from inside the secular house, including people that have long been upheld as beacons of science and reason. So I won't name names, but what I'm getting at is that interrogating this ideology, which affects all children, no matter their gender, requires a scrutiny of the relevant science and discourse. How do we protect our kids from discrimination based on sex and gender? To answer that, we need an updated, far more nuanced view of what science says about sex and gender. So while the book stresses that science is not and should not be necessary to affirm people's humanity and identities, Sometimes we're almost forced to make scientific arguments. And the science is clear. The gender and sex binaries are not biological realities. There are more than two genders and more than two sexes. That's not merely woke hogwash, it's a scientific fact. And it's not only trans people's rights hinging on this, even though trans children are directly in the crosshairs. It's all humans' rights, because basically reducing human beings to preconceived biological functions is dehumanizing. The next chapter shines a light on race, racism, ethnicity, and ancestry. So apologies here for the text-heavy visual, but here are some specifics on what the chapter delves into at a glance. So what's meant by race as a social construct, and how does this affect children? Honoring genomic complexity, the problem with ethnicity results from ancestry DNA tests, the problem with whiteness as a default or a control group in biomedical research and in the world, and tips from experts on how to model anti-racism for kids. One of the case studies in Chapter 5 is the essentialist mythology that drives fat phobia. We've been told that scaring and shaming children into normal weight is necessary and worth it to keep them healthy. But it's actually unacceptable, the same way spanking was normal decades ago and is no longer accepted because we know that it's harmful. Body shaming of all kinds is going the same way. So as the book explains, there's this error in science of assuming the existence of a default or normal version of humans. Like whiteness as a default, people of so-called normal weight, or BMI, which stands for body mass index, or normal mobility, vision, hearing, or anything else, are wrongly taken to be the default, or even optimal. And that's super problematic, not only concerning justice for children, but concerning basic accuracy in how we view and treat our fellow human beings. So the book dismantles the pervasive idea that screen time, taken to be this one homogeneous boogeyman, is a significant cause of the so-called obesity epidemic in children. In reality, weight is simply not a great proxy for well-being. The idea that too much body fat is a moral failure and directly causes an array of health problems, lack of success, and unhappiness is not only bigoted, it's also just not true. So doctors, parents, and policymakers have internalized the misguided view that someone's weight is their own failure. And that myth seeps into all public spaces. So in starting to dismantle the prevailing distortions around BMI and weight, like in its analysis of other issues, the book brings in some relevant history. So underlying the science of human weight is the spurious essentialist idea that there's such a thing as a normal, healthy weight. So while the term BMI was first coined in 1972, the concept has been around for nearly 200 years. A Belgian mathematician by the name of Adolphe Quetelet devised the concept that would later become BMI in the mid-1800s as part of his study of l'homme moyen, or the average man, which looked at a slew of traits to build a model of a normal average man. So to Quetelet, this model of the average man represented the ideal. So the concept of BMI started as part of what was called Quetelet's index, but it was based solely on the measurements of small groups of Western Europeans. And by the turn of the next century, the traits studied in l'homme moyen would be used as scientific justification for eugenics, including the sterilization of disabled people, autistic people, those experiencing poverty, and non-Europeans. Now, chapter 6 is called A Clean Life. I think that this audience would largely agree that everything, even water, is made of chemicals. So despite what seems like a widespread chemophobia or blanket fear of chemicals, most parents and people are generally aware that chemicals are all around us. And what we want to know is which ones are problematic, harmful to the children or the environment, and whether they're tied to explosive or unethical practices. So the discourse around a so-called clean life is about avoiding the chemicals we're told are toxic, especially when they're synthetic, and embracing the more wholesome, wellness-promoting, natural ones. There are chemicals in our communities and homes that harm our children. The problem is that some of the chemicals we're told to worry about are far more harmful than others, while some that are made out to be harmful are actually pretty benign. So we're faced with a huge mix of credible and not so credible information, a lot of which appears legitimate on its surface. Different stakeholders focus on what they call chemicals of concern in food and create what are called no-no lists of chemicals in household products, personal care products, and the environment. So some of the more common fears over specific chemicals are unfounded at best and downright misleading at worst, which distracts us really from everything we should be worrying about, and there's plenty of that. So do these no-no lists that we're supposed to avoid enable us to protect our children and help them thrive? So the book takes a closer look at several of these chemicals of concern that appear on various no-no lists, including ones like MSG, PFAS, pesticides, chemical weapons carried by police departments, radon gas, flame retardants, BPA, and many more. And as I've said before and heard from readers, the book is not just for parents, but for anyone who cares about the future of humanity, including just people who like to nerd out about health, and aunts, uncles, grandparents, any other adults who play leading roles in kids' lives, and even childless cat ladies. But in addition to what I've talked about today, the book also talks about a lot more, which is listed here, including birth, the concept of IQ, the difference between anti-vaxxers and most vaccine-hesitant parents, and how to talk to your friends and loved ones about vaccines, recycling, the microbiome, epigenetics, mental health, guns, and the science of love, bonding, and attachment. So the good news is we all have a capacity to incorporate a deeper understanding of our progressive values into our worldviews and how we treat each other and raise the next generation. So in closing, our job is to support children in cultivating and being their most expansive selves, despite living in this absolute dumpster fire of a time. But the good news is that we're all in it together.
How much of this do you think is willful, purposeful disinformation and just ignorance? Like, how much do you think it's split down there?
I think it's some of both. The people who, I think, like, for example, when we're talking about gender and the denial that, that gender is a spectrum, there are some folks kind of at the top of the hierarchy who will use the trappings of science to promote the binary and to insist that there are only two biological sexes, and therefore we can put we can label bathrooms, with biological male or female, which is absolutely preposterous. And I think the people at the top, it's a bit of ignorance, but it's highly willful ignorance, where people will cherry pick tiny bits of science and information to bolster their views. So it's quite a bit that we're up against.
Hi, can you say something about what you meant by optimization mindset?
Yes. So in simple terms, it's basically the idea that if you do certain things like, say, exclusively breastfeed your infant from birth and feed them organic foods and only provide them with the most wholesome activities, no screen time, none of that loud plastic kid toy stuff, then your child will grow up to be, an athlete for Yale. That's basically what I'm getting at, and it's a fairly common, people don't think about it that explicitly, but it's almost people's goal.
Thank you so much, Kavin.
Thanks, everyone.